It's October 13. My name is Svetlana Cheparenko, and it's my pleasure to see everybody joining us in Ukraine Media Center, Ukrinform, within the main discussion platform of Ukraine Media Hub. We start our first event, and we will be talking about the Russian information influence in Africa. I want to introduce our guests today. It's Anait Hoperia, head of the Department for Countering Information Threats to National Security at the Center for Countering Disinformation under the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. And Diallo Issa Sadio, President of African Council in Ukraine, and joining us online will be Maksym Subkh, Special Representative of Ukraine for the Middle East and Africa. So I propose to start a conversation about Russian propaganda. We all understand that the countries of Africa are very important for Russia, and the roots of Russian propaganda are deep, and they continue to try to do their job there. So, Ms. Anait, what Russia does to spread their narratives, and how did they change within the last year and a half of the full-scale invasion? Good morning. I would like to start with telling about that specifically. And before we start, our center has analyzed a lot of media. We've made a couple of separate studies, one about the narratives of Russian propaganda used in Africa. Unfortunately, I will tell you in more detail about that, and one close study for our government institutions about media, about their tonality, and in general, we were focusing on tonality on the countries of Northern Africa, and I want to say that obviously private media prevail there. The government-controlled media tried to take, so to say, neutral position, but still the coverage of private media is bigger, and the Russian rhetoric sounds way more loud there. And we have to say that for sure we have to reinforce our messages there so that they understand, roughly saying, our and to make sure that the Russians understand that they cannot cover all the territory with their malicious information influence. Thank you. So, talking about the campaigns, I can say that we've analyzed materials starting from the 24th of February 2022 until the 6th of June 23 in Twitter, Facebook. Facebook is surprisingly popular there. And three narratives spread there are, first of all, Russia contributes to global food security and is a reliable trade partner for Africa. Really, we cannot deny, unfortunately for our friends in Africa, Russians are an economic partner, quite powerful economic partner, and even when I say that the government-controlled media, they maintain some neutral position talking about Ukraine, they still do not deny that Russia is their closest partner. Talking about the persons who are outspoken there, one propagandist activist blogger is Natalie Yamp there. She is actively trying to distribute Russian narratives, so to say, and also very active when we were watching, for example, the summit Russia-Africa or 15th summit of BRICS. We noticed that as soon as some messages were produced by Putin, within seconds they were disseminated in Twitter, in all media, in French and Arabic. So they have such an intense resource for distribution of Russian messages there that honestly I'm getting sometimes surprised. So what else is interesting there about those messages? Another very popular and maybe the oldest narrative is that the West is imperialistic and colonialist. This is the narrative that dates back to the times of Soviet Union, and on top of different conflicts going on in the countries of Africa of internal nature, they had significant involvement of Wagner Group, at least on information level, and frequently we were seeing the pictures of people standing there with their flags, the flags of their countries, and Russian flags. So that's the influence of Wagner. They actively work there. And on the website of State Department, there is a message that Natalie Yamp is affiliated to Prigozhin. So what are the instruments that they use to spread the narratives? First of all, it's illustrations, caricatures, TV channels like RT France, no matter that it doesn't work in Africa, they use all the opportunities to spread that propaganda. And there's yet another problem. Not only Putin's messages are intensely disseminated, but also Volodin's or the ministers of economy and someone else, or even many other people whom they are not even supposed to know. And on our side, they only know our president, and the messages of our other officials are not spread so intensely. It's based on analytics. It's not something that I'm just taking out of my head. It's just the information from 33 media where the messages of our president are used, and also they once used a message from Ukrinform. So on top of French speaking, we have to make an Arabic speaking resource to understand what's really going on. And the last narrative that I can tell you about, which is most active there, is that the West provoked the war of Russia in Ukraine, and they continue adding fuel to it. So this narrative is not only popular there, it's popular everywhere. Unfortunately, they continue pressing with their messages that it was the West, the colonizing West, that inspired this conflict, that stimulated that conflict, and nobody denies it. Thus, the people believe that narrative. So who else is active apart from Natalie Yamp? It's Kemi Seba, an activist. He's very active in giving interviews to RT France. The Russians invite him to their TV channels frequently, and one of his messages is like this: the statements that Putin is an aggressor is the lies. It's difficult to see people dying and losing their homes, but Russia had to react. So the people who continue translating Russian narratives, they don't only exist in Europe or in the United States, but also in Africa, also in Egypt. There is Miss Nurhan al-Sheikh. She is, let me tell you, where is she from? She's a member of Egyptian Council for Foreign Affairs. It's a non-government organization. It's just an alternative, roughly saying, speaking organization. And she is also very active in information space of Africa. She is actively spreading the message that Egypt is the only chance that cooperation can be established only with Russia. Ukraine is not something that we need. And this Nurhan al-Sheikh, she is also frequently invited to Russia too. She is quite popular there. And I can say that generally, unfortunately, we're seeing very active messages circulating. They're very intense resources used by Russia in Africa. They will continue doing this because even as they've withdrawn from the grain deal, it was not only a political step but also an information measure. After they've taken that step, they started actively reinforcing their information influence in Africa. So as soon as they've withdrawn from the grain deal, they started influencing the African countries and their information space. And this is why we shouldn't lose vigilance. We should continue working. I think that MFA will tell us about their active work in this area. We will continue working in this area, but still we need more resources. If we talk about media and so on and so forth, we really are missing Arabic-speaking, French-speaking media resources to make sure that our messages, when our president or Minister of Foreign Affairs or anybody who is supposed to make any political statements, so that those messages are immediately translated to that space. And discreditation of those people working for Africa is going on. Our partner countries, for example, on the website of the State Department, when they say that Natalie Yamp is affiliated with Prigozhin, yes, it's happening in parallel. The similar work is done by our center and similar organizations, so this is something that we do on our part. Thank you. Thank you. Apart from media, educational, military, food sector, Mr. Diallo, what are those and other sectors used by Russia for deeper penetration in Africa to achieve their goals? Pardon? Good morning. First, my small request, please don't judge me if my Ukrainian is not quite correct, but I will try my best. I'll try my best to express my thoughts so that understood. So the question: first, there was an invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and many people asked me, how does Africa support, whether Africa supports Ukraine or not in this war? I'm saying that from the very beginning we have to understand that Africa is 55 countries. It's not one single country. It's one continent that consists of many countries. It's difficult to say that Russia supports or doesn't support Ukraine because it's not one country but many countries. On top of that, Africa has a rich colonial history that within the years of independence was supporting, or it was supported by the Soviet Union, so that those countries get their independence, or they were supporting those young countries who became independent with their weak economies, without education, without infrastructure. Russian or Soviet Union was helping a lot the African countries to have them established as the states. But as soon as the Soviet Union split up, Russia inherited all the infrastructure, all the embassies, everything that Soviet Union was building in Africa, it was left to Russia. and the young generations who don't know the history of Soviet Union, they only know the history of Russia. They think that everything that was done by Russia only. It's a negative factor, but some countries, they do know the history. They speak to their children in schools so that they know that many things were done by Soviet Union, not by Russia. So 55 countries of Africa are divided into probably 3 parts. So some of them do support Ukraine either openly or not so openly. Others support Russia, and yet a third part, they maintain neutrality. However, the majority of them non-officially support Ukraine because they see Ukraine as a country that is about to make an example on how their countries can fight for their independence and fight against the colonial past that those countries used to know. To make an example on how the people should get united in fight against a powerful enemy. Thus, Russia uses a lot of connections, not only of political nature but also of information nature, just like my colleague has just mentioned. Really, many media in Africa support Russia. They work openly, being financed by Russia, whether they directly support it or financed through other entities. And many of them are people with quite an extensive audience, and they call themselves Pan-Africanists. And the young generations who are not aware of the Soviet Union, they are easier to be influenced on, it's easier to influence on their mentality, and most likely they believe that those Pan-Africanists, they say that they want freedom and independence for Africa, they want development for Africa, and all of the youth is supposed to support them all across the continent. They should support the guidance of the people who want the democratic development on Africa. However, what we see that Russia is kind of pressing on this young generation. You know, in Africa currently almost 70% of population is youth below 35 years. So basically they don't know the history about the Soviet Union, and they are easier to be influenced on by media. The media may press on their mentality, and yet another way that Russia uses on top of information is education in higher educational institutions. Is the access to higher education. In many countries of Africa currently people cannot get visas or stipends to study in the Western countries, like for example France, and such countries as Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and many other. For them it's very difficult to obtain visas, and they are thus forced, the students are forced to go to Russia to get a degree, to get a higher education. That's yet another option Russia uses for their pressure to get the people of Africa under their influence. And the third thing is the food security, like my colleague has also mentioned. It's another factor. Many countries do have problems with food, and moreover, they have problems with fertilizers that are very necessary for agricultural activities. The ports of Ukraine are currently unable to ship fertilizers to Africa, and Russia also uses it as a lever of pressure. And they offer to provide their fertilizers and food for a number of African countries. And yet another way of influence is military. We know that many African countries do not have strong economies. They don't have strong democracies. Let's talk openly. And they are quite politically unstable. And Russia uses this as a tool. They provide arms and ammunition to the people on whom they can influence and thus manage those countries. At the same time, they're saying that they help to establish democracies in those countries so that those countries become independent from their past colonizers. But in fact, it's not so. One colonizer is forcing another colonizer to withdraw, to be able to get the riches and natural resources of those African countries, which have currently very extensive potential in terms of natural resources deposits. And the diplomatic consequences that remained after the Soviet Union this is what Russia has got, and Ukraine, I'm sure Mr. Maksym Subkh will tell about the ways the representative offices of Ukraine act in the African countries, but I'm confident that the African countries want to work with Ukraine. Many of them want to have an experience of Ukrainian. They want to familiarize themselves with the experience of fight against such a powerful enemy as Russia, and also the way that the Ukrainian people united to stand together and to have one direction for development of the country. Thank you very much. I will really appreciate that you study Ukrainian and that you speak Ukrainian. Well, you see, well, I would like to continue our conversation about the diplomatic and economic aspect of Russian influence in Africa. Mr. Maksym, we understand, as we've heard from the previous panelists, we understand that Russia has very deep roots in different sectors of Africa. Ukraine, let's be honest, have started only now. We are only taking the first steps to establish the political and economic dialogue. So how do we influence, or how do we counteract the influence of Russia in Africa on economic and political levels, and what are the methods that we use? Good morning, dear colleagues. I appreciate all the work done by the organizers of this briefing or this meeting of ours, which is dedicated to a very pressing topic, a very pressing matter, the counteraction to Russian narratives in Africa, counteraction to aggressive anti-Ukrainian rhetorics of Russia in African continent. This topic is becoming increasingly pressing, and I want to thank previous speakers, Mrs. Anait and Mr. Diallo, my old friend, for an interesting explanation and observations that they've made within this period of full-scale aggression of Russia against Ukraine. You were right to mention that Russia systemically and continuously works in the information field using very significant administrative, diplomatic, and information, and first of all, financial resources. They have many programs financed by Russia, opening of correspondent posts in legal area of Russian propaganda in Africa. It's cooperation between the representative offices of so-called Россотрудничество, Russian cooperation offices in African continent. It's multi-million budgets spent from the budget of Russian Federation to promote Russian propaganda, anti-Ukrainian and anti-Western narratives in favor of Russia. First of all, to disrupt the security of African countries with accent on those countries where Russia was not historically represented, the countries mostly of western and southern part of Africa. And now Russia actively uses certain tension existing between a number of African countries, specifically in Sahel region, against the previous metropolia, if you want, colonizers of those countries. And we have to acknowledge that it's the fact that Russia emerges there is not an achievement of Russian diplomacy or the work of their special services. Significant influence also is a result of bad coordination between the countries of the West and the governments of those countries, from the point of view of spreading first or reestablishing the stability in those countries. Unfortunately, within a long period, the situation was not getting better due to objective or subjective reasons, and Russia, in fact, played on this disappointment of local population, local elites, local societies, to represent themselves as a savior, as an alternative to the Western forces, Western countries. Our work in MFA is to communicate the proper information about Ukraine, about Russian aggression, and it's supported by the visits of our official delegations, number of which is unprecedented comparing to all the previous since our independence. It doesn't even compare. I'm talking about the visits of a Minister of Foreign Affairs and other government officials, including the officials from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there are interparliamentary cooperation missions, trade and economic missions, and within the last year and a half, a little bit more, since the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion, the number of such contacts is in hundreds, maybe even more than 1,000 of such contacts on different levels. It's very important. It demonstrates that we are not isolated, that we don't go to Africa to convince somebody to go against somebody else, but the strategy we built is that our relations with the African countries should be based on equal and fair foundation. There should be mutual trust in our relations, and we have to acknowledge we're still missing resources, including financial resources, that would allow us to establish maximum presence in Africa. By presence, I mean diplomatic presence. Diplomatic presence of Ukraine is now represented by 10 embassies in African continent, and as Mr. Issa has properly mentioned, Africa cannot be perceived as something integral with a similar or the same sentiment, or where the common goals are shared or common approaches to their practical realization. So we take all those facts into account, but a very positive signal and element is the decision taken by the President of Ukraine in the end of year 2022 about the necessity to expand our diplomatic presence in Africa. You know, this decision was approved by the President. Ministry of Foreign Affairs continues on opening new diplomatic institutions in Africa. We hope that until the end of this year, we will initiate the operation of a number of such diplomatic representative offices. This is a very good step that was approved of by our African friends, and they really think that it's necessary, it's needed, because lack of information, even regardless the accessibility of this information to this information in the century 21, we know how non-homogeneous is the information space of African continent. In some countries, access to internet is free, but in many countries on the internet and mass media there is a very strict censure. Not so much people pay attention to it in the West, in the countries with more developed economies. but in some African countries, the only way of getting information is radio broadcasting. So a lot of efforts should be taken to spread information about Ukraine by Ukrainians or by our African friends, including African community, African diaspora, unions of Africans who work, live, or used to work or live or study in Ukraine. So in our work, we don't only use standard explanations or approaches to interpretation of nature of Russian aggression. We have a number of advantages about which we should not forget, and that we should, the ones we should continue using. I'm not going to stop at Russian narratives. They are known to everybody. There were one way or another already emphasized, but I would like to just draw everyone's attention to those small positive moments, positive matters that our diplomatic services use to withdraw from those cliches, from those labels that Russia is putting on us as Ukraine. So first of all, we are witnessing the level of awareness about Ukraine, specifically thanks to those measures that I've mentioned. Then in Africa, Ukraine is not associated with colonial past or oppressors. That's a great plus, and thus in this area Russia is trying to monopolize our common past when Ukraine was part of a common state with current Russian Federation. We should not let Russia distort the historic facts and represent them as Russian achievements to equalize Russia with Soviet Union in those positive matters that are still remembered in Africa. Also, Ukraine was never a part of any conflicts in the territory of African continent. On contrary, we were forwarding our peacekeepers to Africa, and this is highly estimated by African countries, by United Nations organization, and the African countries expect our country to be able to provide the security services for African continent after our victory, as it happened before. The importance of education was emphasized today too. We would like the African students to resume their education in Ukraine. The work is underway on facilitating all those problematic matters the African students are currently facing as they were forced to leave Ukraine. It's another topic. We know many cases when Russian Federation wanted to persuade the students from Africa to study in Russia rather than in Ukraine, but many of them stated that they have no moral right to study in Russia, as Russia was exactly the reason they were forced to leave their education process. Their future was basically ruined by the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Talking about agriculture, there is no single doubt that African people, African governments are convinced that Ukraine has the right and Ukraine is supposed to be an active factor which can guarantee a global food security. Actions of Russia on withdrawal from grain initiative were condemned by leaders of a number of African countries at that very same infamous summit. That was yet another slap for Russian diplomacy, since it was boycotted by a number of countries, and those who were represented on the level below the leaders of the countries, which is a merit of our diplomacy and a cooperation with our leading partners and allies who clearly communicated the signals, the right signals to African countries. But again, Ukraine does not interfere the internal policies of African countries. We don't try to influence the agenda of African countries. We focus on that. We focus everyone's attention on that. We do not criticize any African countries with regard to human rights. However, Ukraine was always the guarantor of human rights and democracy. However, we understand that African countries are the sovereign states that have their judicial system, they have their constitutions, and they are able to build their internal policies themselves. But we support any aspirations of Africa in terms of reformation of United Nations organization. Our position is very strict about representation of many more members in the Security Council of United Nations. We support the right of veto to be vested in some of the African countries if this right of veto would not be reviewed. It is perceived very positively by the African countries, and if we revert to the matter of food security, the interest of African countries in the summits led by the president of Ukraine, called Grain from Ukraine. We will have another summit in the end of November. It's yet another confirmation that Africa does not agree with status quo, that they should depend on Russia. Many presidents of African countries, they say that we are not slaves. We don't want to be in position of somebody who keeps asking Russia about something. Russia is supposed to open the ports. Russia is supposed to resume the operation of the grain corridor, because Ukraine should be an equal player and Africa should have a right to choose a partner on a competitive basis to ensure their food security. You know, the principle existing in Africa about the solution of conflicts. African solutions for African problems. We take a lot of efforts to make sure that this principle becomes a gateway to understanding that Russian invasion against Ukraine is not a conflict that is somewhere far away. The echoes of this war is heard by African countries, but for us it's important to explain the causes of it. Here we get back to the matter of resources as well, but we keep working on solution of this or those matters to ensure the information support. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs developed and is about to approve the communication strategy for Africa. That will be a fundamental document which is about to envisage all the challenges, threats, and approaches for overcoming Russian propaganda in Africa and counteraction. Mr. Maksym, I apologize. We have certain restrictions in terms of time, so can you please summarize it? Well, I would like to summarize that the main areas where Ukraine could cooperate with Africa is, as we've already mentioned, it's the agriculture, industrial economic partnership, digitalization. Ukraine is now becoming a leader in digital technologies in terms of cooperation with African countries. They have a great interest to all those issues. It's a peacekeeping activity, defense and security complex. So again, I appreciate the allocated time. Within this time, unfortunately, it's difficult to cover all the topics that I would like to cover, but again, I would like to thank you for organization of our today's conversation. So we in Ministry of Foreign Affairs are always ready to get involved in similar events and to explain what the MFA currently does to overcome all those challenges of Russian propaganda, specifically in Africa. Thank you. Thank you. We have questions from the journalists. Good morning, Nadia Yurchenko, Ukrinform. My question is to Mr. Maksym and to other speakers if they wish to answer. Do I understand it correct that Russia is basically the only country who cares about promotion of their interests in Africa, that their narratives are the most widespread there? Do the Western countries feel any necessity to counteract this Russian narrative, to promote not probably Ukrainian, but their narratives there? And that said, the African Union was invited to join G20. Is it going to influence the information balance in Africa, somehow balance this Russian influence by spreading maybe other narratives to explain the position of the West? Thank you. Thank you for this question. Obviously, Russia is not the only party, not the only force, not the only country trying to promote the interests in Africa. We're just going through a historic moment, you know, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, and from Russian media sources we're hearing mostly anti-West and anti-Ukrainian rhetorics, because the state of affairs is such that Russia is trying to distort that objective information about the facts that they are aggressor, they are occupiers, they are the colonizer in anti-colonial clothing. So there is a number of countries of the West, like European Union, big countries, United States, former metropolia. They all have their interests, and I would like to emphasize it again. I keep talking about it again and again. Russia cannot compete with countries of the West or China or Turkey in terms of economic cooperation. This is why Russia, in fact, remains the exporter of raw products. They will remain like this for a very long time. They have very little projects they can really take pride in Africa, because they make a lot of statements, and this is what we were drawing the attention of our European colleagues. I was making visits to Europe myself, and during those visits we were comparing those promises made by Russia during Africa-Russia summit in the year 2019, and we were comparing with the results as of 2023. So those results, they cannot even be criticized in any way. You know that there are many European countries that do the oil and gas mining in Africa. Turkey is building infrastructure together with China. So it's a matter that should be viewed in a broader context. We have allies in Africa, the countries with whom we can be partners, not necessarily big European countries. We can talk about the countries that are comparable to Ukraine in terms of economy, with whom we could implement joint projects. Talking about your second question, invitation of African Union to G20, or as we say, G19, obviously it's a great diplomatic victory of African Union. Is the reflection of the role of Africa in future. in the future of global politics and economy, and it's important that the integration of African markets into global economic space opens new opportunities for Ukraine too, because we know that the agreement on foundation of African free trade zone is being implemented in Africa. New supply chains should be emerging for the products that are being manufactured in Africa. African countries will withdraw from importing of some products by localization of that manufacturing facilities, and Ukraine could find its niche there by relocating their businesses there to manufacture Ukrainian products in cooperation with African countries, which products will be further exported to the markets of those African countries. It's a positive phenomena, I think, and the invitation of African Union to G20 from our point of view is a very positive step. Another mark from the speakers. Thank you. Talking about the information component, what you've said, unfortunately we haven't opened the presentation, but there is a caricature against France. What I mean is that Russians do not only discredit us as the countries, but they also do to the Western countries, specifically France. You understand why. So there is a number of types of influence there. Talking about G20, it's if there is a balance, well, there probably will be a balance, but Russians react to any geopolitical changes, to any changes in principle in those countries where they have some interests, and they always use the weaknesses of those countries, and they distort the news in the way that they want. And I'm sure they are about to reinforce that narrative that West is a colonizer, don't trust anybody but Russia. So basically, yes, our friends from Africa should be careful about that. Thank you for the question. I would like to mention that recently there is a sentiment that this narrative about what Russia is doing against Ukraine, it means that Russia is afraid of Ukraine a lot. And it's not a negative phenomenon for other countries. Because if we talk about using all the resources, financial resources, human potential to discredit Ukraine, it only means that Ukraine is a powerful country that can counteract Russia everywhere, including Africa. And Russia acts there not only against Ukraine. Russia sees Ukraine as an ally of other European and Western countries. And this is why they're promoting their narratives against Ukraine and other Western countries. China, India, Turkey, they work there too, but Russia wants to keep them as their partners rather than the enemies. Thank you. Another question, please, briefly, the briefest possible.
We should have, Chris Samson, National Security Media, we should have a lot more of this conversation, because this is one of the most important areas that Ukraine has to develop internationally. So basically, to break it down into two questions. What are the strategic interests with Ukraine and the situation that's happening in Israel? do to confront when it comes to confronting the Islamic regime? Number one, and then for Issa, what can we do to bring more of a relationship between African community and here in Kiev, and what can we do to empower the efforts that you've done to explore this bridge? Дякую.
Прошу буквально хвилинка, бо у нас час підтискає.
Добре.
Just a second, because the time is pressing. Well, the relations between African countries and Ukraine are developing quite intensely, as Mr. Maksym Subkh has mentioned. Now we work on possible ways to intensify the relations between African countries and Ukraine, not only in education, businesses and agriculture, but also in industrial sector and others, including the information cooperation. And we need to use those Africans who graduated Ukrainian educational institutions so that they become a bridge between Ukraine and Africa. Those who live in Ukraine currently, they work actively, and we will engage them in discussions, in debates, to demonstrate that Africa is also open and that Africa also has some knowledge and experience to reinforce those relations. We also work with the Africans who graduated from Ukrainian higher educational institutions, and they work with the governments of different African countries. We will continue this cooperation to reinforce our relations. Thank you. There was also the question about Israel. It's not so much related to our topic, so I propose to bring it outside this discussion, but we have yet another question. Good morning.
І також наша
I am Red Platens, diplomat from Washington, and I represent the Association Journalists Against Corruption and organization. Our organization also producing Ukrainian film. We have this association here. It's called Ukraine Forever. So we have one question. I also wanted to ask it. I am from Iraq. I am a Muslim. How can we say that Israel is like Ukraine? In Ukraine, we have 100% truth.
They have 100%, even in Israel, in America, everywhere, not 100%.
Your question, please.
So the question is, how do we equate ourselves with Israel as a country, Ukraine, and what should our next diplomatic steps be with the Arab world, who will feel incredibly upset about this type of analogy, who maybe consider Palestine to be like Israel?
Дякую. Ми знову повертаємось до питання Ізраїля мусульманських країн. Давайте об'єднаємо відповідь на два попередніх.
The question is very actual. It's really a pressing issue, and it's difficult for me to answer. But in my opinion, we shouldn't make parallels between Ukraine and Israel in this specific matter. Every part of this issue should be considered separately. There is Ukrainian reality and there is a reality of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and my opinion is that it's impossible to draw any parallels here. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Maksym, do you have anything to add? Well, you said that this question is really outside our today's topic, but since it was already asked, I can say that it's with a great concern that we continue watching the events unfolding in Israel, in Sector Gaza, but Ukraine condemns terrorism in any of its expressions. Such a barbaric action, such atrocities against civil population, they should be always condemned, and Ukraine is going through the same story. Unfortunately, all that footage that we've seen in the beginning of these events in Sector Gaza and Israel, I think, reminded all of Ukraine about that horrible footage from Irpin and Bucha. So we only want all the parties to get back to dialogue. Palestine has legitimately elected president, legitimately elected government, which is a representative of the Palestinian people. So I think the dialogue should continue between the governments of Israel and Palestine. Ukraine was in favor of fulfilling the resolutions of the United Nations Organization, the Security Council. Ukraine supports the principle of both independent sovereign countries which live in peace and security side by side. This is why us as Ukraine, we were never withdrawn from the fundamental principles of respect to international law, but we call to stop the violence. We condemn the terror, specifically terror against civil population. You know, we have a large number of Ukrainians living both in Israel and Sector Gaza and the West Bank too, and we are concerned about the lives of our citizens. Unfortunately, according to the information we have, 7 of our citizens are already dead. According to the information from our embassy, some of our citizens may be held captive by the Hamas terrorists, and we are interested, just like any other countries of the world, to have this conflict stopped, to have the humanitarian corridors established which would ensure safe evacuation of civil population. Thank you, Mr. Maksym. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up because we're out of time. I'm reminding you, within main discussion platform Brain Hub, we were talking about the Russian information influence in Africa, and we will continue our operation at 1300. We will have a panel discussion on Ukrainian economy during full-scale invasion. Thank you for staying with us.